Thank you, Bruce. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Mr. Michael Moir. This is his second appearance at the Historical Society, and I know he's done at least one other presentation for a local Provost Club, and I'm sure there's probably a scout or two here, because I'm sure people will have a lot of interest in tonight's presentation as well. Michael is the archivist at York University and head archivist at the Claire Thomas Archives and Special Collections. His research interests are in Canadian shipbuilding and the port and harbour management in Canada during the 19th and 20th centuries. Both Susan and I have had the pleasure of sharing the museum's collections with Michael and his research, and I know we're both very excited for his presentation tonight, and I'd just like to welcome you to the podium, Michael. You join me,
Thank you very much, Melissa, for the kind introduction. I can tell you that both Melissa and Susan watched me like a hawk, and with good reason, when I was using their reading room. What I'd like to talk to you about tonight is what I would call a brief history of Collingwood and shipbuilding. And I say brief because it really is quite a long and extensive history, and one that really you can't do justice to in 45 minutes or so. Just as a word of background, the reason that I got into shipbuilding in the first place, even though I come from Toronto, which is a very unmaritime city, is because I worked for 9 years as the archivist for the Toronto Harbour Commission at a time that was extremely volatile, and in some ways the history of the organization gave me a place to hide. But what I've discovered is really Ontario and Canada as a whole has an extremely rich and vibrant history in terms of its maritime past, but also in particular in terms of its shipbuilding. So what I'd like to talk to you about tonight then is Collingwood and shipbuilding. So we start, of course, with the early settlement, which I'm sure none of you will be surprised at, follows very closely the water courses. In the late 18th century, when the area began to be populated by Europeans, it was very much based on access by water, not only for people, but also for goods and for information. And so in order to be connected to the larger transatlantic world, one really needed to be close to the St. Lawrence or to the lakes, the lower lakes. And this plan, which is from the early 1800s, gives you a sense of where Ontario, or Upper Canada as it was at the time, has been settled so far. So nothing's really reaching up to Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. It's still very much the woodland. Further north, it's, I think, it's the indigenous hunting ground, and Lake Superior, of course, is still sort of terra incognita at this point. As the century progresses, however, the place begins to fill up. And so by 1860, you can start to see the framework of a railway network, and of course, one of the major lines is connecting Toronto to Collingwood. Now, Collingwood was an important point for the business community in Toronto to connect with the expanding Northwest. Just as we talked about, well, I see that our Prime Minister was on the news today wanting Canadians to be known to be resourceful, and not just because of our resources. But really much of Canadian history ties back to the extraction of natural resources from this country. So by the middle of the 19th century, in the 1850s, as we begin to look at railway expansion out of Toronto, one of the first places that they tap into is Collingwood, because Collingwood is the shortest route by rail to connect to steamships that will tie us to the expanding Northwest, and in particular to ensure that that Northwest stays British as opposed to American. Well, it doesn't take very long for the place to begin to fill up. When you look at 1897, the red lines that you can see here are the rail networks. And by and large, what they're attempting to do was to connect in various ports and harbors across the lower and upper lakes. in order to tie into the steamship routes. So that waterborne connection is extremely important. In the 19th century, we're looking at the beginning of wooden boat building in Collingwood. So the first boat built in Collingwood was reported to be the Brothers, which was a small schooner rig, later fitted with a boiler and a steam engine. This combination of sail and steam was actually quite common, even going into the early 20th century. Many of the schooners that were built in the Maritimes, for instance, during the First World War, were a combination of sail and steam. So in the 1850s, we start with the schooner rig. What you actually see on the screen here is the Hotchkiss. And the Lewis Hotchkiss was built in 1870 by Alfred Morrill for the Muskoka Mill and Lumber Company. It took 3 days to launch the stubborn boat. She would sink in 1891, some 20 miles west of Goderich while bound for Buffalo. This is the kind of boat that would have been built to move lumber, a very important activity within the local economy. In fact, much of what you see going on in terms of the connection between industrialists and shipbuilding is the need to move lumber out of the Parry Sound and Georgian Bay area. In some ways, when you look at most accounts of the history of shipbuilding in Collingwood, they tie it back to 1883. And this is the year that the Queen's Dry Dock was opened in Collingwood. Now, dry docks really come in two forms. The ones that are built into the ground, such as the ones in Collingwood, are actually known as graving docks. The other type of dry dock is the floating dry dock, such as the one that operated in Toronto for much of the 20th century. In Collingwood, however, through the support of Collingwood's council, local investors were able to get support to lease the property, began work in July 1882, and within a year completed this dry dock for $35,000. Bit of a bargain. And when you look at the state of the dry dock as it existed on the 3rd of July 1883, one could probably see why it was done on the cheap. By the 24th of May 1883, we have the official opening. In fact, it was on Queen Victoria's birthday that the Queen's Dry Dock opened in Collingwood. And as the year went on, there were 4 ships in the dry dock for repairs. So there was some activity. Repair was a very important activity on the Great Lakes. It was not unusual for ships to go aground. It's not unusual in foggy weather for ships to collide. And so it became essential in order to maintain the economic vitality of the lakes to have facilities where ships could be repaired. And the advantage to the graving dock is that it could be brought in to the dock, the cofferdams would be closed behind it, the gates, and the water pumped out so that workers could actually get down to the hull and fix any damage that had occurred because the ship might have grounded. Quite often, particularly within the Great Lakes, the currents shift sand in such a way that what you thought was navigable at one time, 6 months later, may suddenly have become shallow. And as they run aground, timbers would have been damaged, and later steel would be damaged. And so having this kind of facility in your town was important to bring the ships in. Collingwood was also quite important because of its harbor, because it provided a sheltered location for ships to winter. You know, was it the Chicken and Hen Island? Gave it that protection so that a ship could easily navigate in, particularly when the wind was blowing from the northwest. So because of that protection, Collingwood, as well as because of that connection to the railway, was ideally situated for this kind of activity. Well, after 5 years of sporadic activity and 6 months of complete idleness, Collingwood's council was finally able to drum up 3 investors to lease the dry dock for $1 a year for 21 years in exchange for an agreement to spend not less than $5,000 a year on yard improvement. Council also agreed to suspend the taxes for 10 years. So this is very much an industry that's being driven by the Board of Trade, and many of those members of the Board of Trade are also sitting on City Council. The group was led by Thomas Long. Those of you who are familiar with Collingwood's history will have run into him quite often, I'm sure. would be one of the investors that had started up the Great Northern Transit Company, later known as the Northern Navigation Company. And so in September 1889, they opened the Dry Dock and Wrecking Company of Collingwood. Sort of ironic that shipbuilding doesn't get mentioned in the title anywhere, just Dry Dock and Wrecking. Regardless of the fact, it's not too long before they actually start building ships. One of its most well-known ships is the Majestic, which was a mainstay of the Northern Navigation Company's fleet. And this ship was built in 1895. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see the Majestic in all its glory, with its bunting and flags. Now to the right, you can see the boiler that's coming in by rail. This is a boiler that was actually made in Toronto. At this point, Collingwood didn't have the capacity, the machine shop and the boiler shop, to prepare this kind of machinery in-house. Instead, it had to be shipped, in this case, from the John Inglis and Son Company down in Toronto. In the lower right-hand corner, I hope you can see, is the interior of the dining room. These passenger vessels that were constructed in Collingwood really represented the splendor of the Edwardian age. So against the far wall, you can see the waiters, the serving staff, in their finest livery, and all the tables being set up for a meal. In keeping with this tradition, the construction of wooden hulls ends in Collingwood in 1899, the end of the century really, and this is with the launch of the Germanic. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the wooden frames for the Germanic starting to take form. Down in the middle, you get a sense of how popular these ships were in terms of moving passengers around on the Great Lakes. And up in the upper right-hand corner is a nice little card that ties the Germanic in nicely with the Northern Navigation Company. Quite cute, and this one is from the Collingwood Museum. So with the new century, we have a new industry, and this is steel shipbuilding. Collingwood Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company was established on the 4th of May, 1900, with $200,000 in capital, situated on that government harbor of refuge, with a shipyard capable of constructing at one time for the largest class of vessels required for navigation on the upper lakes. John Lund, the president of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company, pursued a federal dry dock subsidy of 3% in January 1904. The company had spent over $550,000 on construction of the dry dock, receiving $50,000 from the town of Collingwood as an inducement to establish a shipbuilding plant, along with exemption from taxes for another 21 years. So there's this very close connection between shipbuilding and governments. I'm sure all of you probably hear about that in the last couple of years with the National Shipbuilding Program. This is nothing new. When we look back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the relationship with shipbuilders and government was very important. Not only the federal government, which would not only provide subsidies for dry docks and later subsidies for cargo that was built in Canada, but would also commission new vessels like dredges and tugs, buoy tenders, and a variety of other vessels that I'll talk about shortly. But in the short term, they also offered this subsidy for the dry dock. So the first dry dock number 1, was constructed in Collingwood in 1904. And you can see a couple of the vessels that are in being serviced. This is a photograph from May 1907. Up on the shore to the right of the photograph, you can start to see the hull of the Collingwood take form. This is a bulk carrier that we'll be seeing in a moment. Towards the middle of the photograph, you can see those small steps. That forms the backbone upon which the ship sits as the water is being drained out by the pumps. And then it's shored up from either side so that the vessel doesn't tip while people are working in the hull. This dock, by the way, was 530 feet in length, 78 feet across, and 60 feet across at the bottom, made wholly of stone and concrete masonry. As I mentioned before, the Collingwood was taking form. This was 406 feet long, quite substantial when you think of it. This is hull number 8, I think, in the in the yard's history. It's the first Canadian ship to carry iron ore between two ports. It didn't take long, however, for dry dock number 1 to be too busy. And so Thomas Long goes back to the federal government and asks for subsidy for dry dock number 2. And so both of these dry docks, both of the slips for these dry docks are still in place, not too far from where we're located. And so this is 1908. You can see work is moving along very well with dry dock number 2. Again, another subsidies obtained from the federal government in order to make this a paying proposition. And it's soon put to good use. This is hull number 18. This is the Harmonic, a combination passenger vessel and freight carrier named after H.C. Hammond, the president of the Northern Navigation Company. The keel was laid on the 26th of May, 1908, and by the 26th of November, it was ready to launch. You can see here the flags on the mast. It's just about ready to go into the dry dock that's been flooded to accommodate the new vessel. 365 feet long, but with 7,000 horsepower, driven by quadruple expansion engines. A magnificent ship. The sort of ship that became, I think, quite important to the passenger trade on the Great Lakes. In this case, it operated out of Sarnia, taking passengers to Lakehead and Duluth, later adding Detroit and Windsor. So in terms of maintaining these connections, long before there were automobiles and highways, there were the passenger ships that would also carry packet freight. And after the passenger trade died down, when people didn't want to be on the lakes in November, then packet freight was often the primary client or use for these vessels. Well, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about John Shearer Leach, a rather interesting individual, and someone who really does not get an awful lot of attention. In fact, one could probably spend the entire evening talking about Leach and his contribution. Prior to Leach's arrival, Canada's shipbuilding industry was facing significant challenges. It cost 25% more to build a ship in Canada than it did in Britain because of labor costs. It's sort of ironic that when the yard begins to prepare for closing in the 1980s, that same number is being trotted out, that Canada is still 25% more expensive to build in than Britain. So with the introduction of steam, iron, and steel, it was cheaper to import large commercial vessels from Britain than it was to build in this country. When the Department of Marine and Fisheries was asked to identify private companies that were active in the business in 1911, it could think of only 7 firms. Those who owned the shipyards wondered why the marine transportation industry would languish under free trade conditions when the provincial government of Nova Scotia had offered tax exemptions to build steel ships, and BC did the same. Also, in terms of the railways, manufacturers of locomotives were given bounties to produce the equipment and to produce the railways. So steel shipbuilding had always sort of languished behind, but not getting the same federal support that the railways were getting. Collingwood, on the other hand, thrived under the leadership of John Shearer Leach. Leach was born in 1880 in New York City. And even though he was born in the States, he was very much, I think, Scottish by his mindset. He learned the shipbuilding trade at Glasgow and Newcastle on Tyne, and graduated with honors in naval architecture from South Kensington, which is now known as the Imperial College in London. After apprenticing as a shipbuilder and draftsman, he was put in charge of the drafting room at Workman, Clark and Company in Belfast, and was appointed the company's assistant manager in 1911. The following year, and I'm not really sure why, but in the following year he emigrates to Canada and comes to Collingwood, which would have been very different than his life in Belfast. He took up the position of managing director and served in that position until he retired in 1946, taking the shipyard through 2 world wars. In the Second War, he actually ran 4 shipyards at the same time. he was leading the program to build the ships that were necessary for the Royal Canadian Navy, as well as some vessels that served with the US Navy and the Royal Navy in the Second War. So Collingwood remained very busy throughout his early years, using the dry docks for a steady stream of repairs and the adjoining property to build canalers like the Keystone, bulk carriers like the James Carruthers, the J.H.G. Haggerty, and the Westmount, bucket dredges for the federal government, and passenger and car ferries for service between Windsor and Pelee Island, as well as 5 tankers from the Imperial Oil Company. And this starts a relationship between Collingwood and the Imperial Oil Company that really goes on well into the late 20th century. In the 6 years since Leach's arrival, the yard produced 12 vessels with a total capacity of 36,761 gross tons. Now that's a measurement that I'll use a couple of times. And there seems to be 2 primary measurements that I run into in terms of shipbuilding. One is the gross tons, which is 100 cubic feet. I know we think of tons as being a weight, but in the case of ships, if it's a gross ton, it's a cubic foot measurement. The other unit of measure that tends to be used is the deadweight tonnage, which is the weight of cargo that can be carried along with fuel and passengers. And that is usually measured, at least during this time, in long tons, which I think is 2,200 pounds. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Anyways, so we get up, by this point, Leach has been on the scene for a few years. In November 1916, we see a major change. Roy Wolven and Joseph Norcross joined with Horace Bruce Smith to purchase the assets of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company. This is, I think, a very major development in terms of what happens over the next few years. So Roy Wolven is an American who spent some time in Winnipeg, spent some time in Montreal, ends up running the British American Steel Company and creating all sorts of problems down in Nova Scotia in the 1920s. For a time, runs the Halifax Shipyard as well. But in this case, in 1916, he gets together with Joseph Norcross, another important figure in Canadian maritime history who's virtually unknown. At this point, Norcross is a vice president with the Canada Steamship Lines. And he's built several ships himself, so he knows exactly how things work. And he's living in Montreal. Then Horace Bruce Smith is actually living in Owen Sound. I think he's the president of the Bent Chair Furniture Company, which always sounds like an odd name for a company to me, but I assume that it involved a certain amount of steam. In any event, Smith was a solicitor, an industrialist, and also president of the Northern Navigation Division of the Canada Steamship Lines. So the 3 of them get together, and they create a new company with a capital of $2.6 million. So you may recall a few minutes ago that when I talked about the dry dock company starting in 1900, 200,000. Well, bring in Wolven, Smith, and Norcross, we're looking at 2.6 million in order to do things on this property. It's also interesting to note, for me, that when the shares were distributed in January 1917, 500 went to Trevor Dawson of the British Maritime Trust Limited, which owned Vickers, Son and Maxim in England, one of the biggest British shipyards. Looking at the images on the screen, by the way, up in the upper left corner is the bulk carrier Westmount being constructed in 1916. There's something about the geometry of these photographs that I just find so appealing. We're looking down the length of the vessel at the frames that are taking place. Steel frames. You see the floor being riveted in place in the hold. In the bottom left-hand corner is one of the barges, one of the dredges that were built for the federal government. At this time, the federal government was putting in a substantial amount of money to improve canals and waterways in Canada. At this point, shipping was still a major force in moving goods and people. And so it became vitally important to ensure that rivers and harbors were still navigable. And so quite a bit of money was spent constructing the dredges that would go to work, primarily in eastern Canada, from the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic seaports. Now, not only do the 3 the three characters by Collingwood. This is Woven, Norcross, and Smith, but they also buy Kingston. Well, in Kingston, a new dry dock had been constructed in 1891. And in March 1910, the first meeting of the Kingston Shipbuilding Company was held. Its shareholders were Captain Alex McDougall of Duluth, Minnesota, who was the president of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company, Horace Bruce Smith from Owen Sound, Simon Diamond, a director of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company, James Matthew Smith, who was the manager of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company. So there was this strong Collingwood representation in the development of the shipyard in Kingston. Its share capital is $500,000, not too bad. And by 1910, the directors accept a contract to build a quarantine ship for the Dominion government. And you can see that quarantine ship being launched here in 1910. December 1916, the old guard of McDougall and Diamond are bought out by Norcross, Woven, and Smith, and also Leach in this case. And so March 1917, Thomas Long also gets bought out. The shares go to Norcross and Woven, who become directors. And Woven becomes the president of Kingston Shipbuilding. So there's extremely strong connection between Collingwood and Kingston, a very distributed model of manufacturing, if you like. And so all the way through the First World War and into the 1920s, Collingwood controlled what was going on down at the Kingston shipyard. It became a satellite operation that in many ways was conducted through mail, but also through telegraph. Well, as those of you who heard me last April may recall, much was going on in 1915, 1916, and none of it was nice. The war breaks out in August 1914, of course. By 1915, the Germans have declared submarine war against Allies and neutrals in response to the commercial blockade that the Royal Navy establishes against Germany. And so it starts out rather slow. The British think that they have this situation under control. But by 1916, it becomes painfully obvious that they're losing ships at a rate far faster than they can replace them. And this becomes very critical for Britain because it's a country that by and large depends upon imports in order to feed its people. In fact, they reach a situation in April 1917 where they have, I think, 6 weeks of wheat left, and they're still 10 weeks away from the harvest. And so they actually begin to talk at the cabinet level of the possibility of having to surrender, not because of what was going on during the land campaigns in Europe, but because of the threat of starvation. And so the submarine menace becomes suddenly a very real concern in 1916 in a way that it never had to be worried about in the years leading up to this. So the first response that affects Canada is the decision to build trawlers. It's sort of ironic in a way that technology had advanced to the point where submarines could now travel across the Atlantic in torpedo merchant ships coming out of port on the Atlantic coast of Canada, but technology had not advanced to the point where they could actually detect those submarines. So unlike the Second World War movies that you see where there's sonar that can ping off the submarines, they know what's underneath them when the corvettes and the destroyers are out there. In the First World War, there was no way other than looking for the periscope and looking for the wake of the torpedo as it came before your ship. And so the response was to create a large fleet of patrol craft, such as these trawlers. Now these were armed trawlers. These were battle-class trawlers. And they were built really across the Great Lakes as well as in Montreal. The program is headed up by Joseph Norcross. So not only was he buying shipyards, not only was he helping to run the Canada Steamship Lines, but he becomes the director of naval construction for the Department of Naval Service. So even though it's the Admiralty who's paying for all this, at least they were initially until Britain ran out of money and had to turn to Canada, it's Norcross that's actually running all this. And so you start to see the importance of having that connection between Norcross and Montreal in his operation in Collingwood under Leach, and also having access to the yard in Kingston, which suddenly became a location for building steel trawlers. So the fleet is 36 steel trawlers built in Canada, along with 100 wooden drifters. 6 trawlers were built at Collingwood, TR7 to TR12, as part of the Royal Navy's Castle class, 135 feet long and a 23-foot beam, which could accommodate a crew of 17. Many were later purchased as fishing trawlers, but during the war, they would actually use them as minesweepers. And so there would be a cable running between these 2 trawlers, and they would go out into an area where they knew was mined, and they would use that cable to try and cut the chain that was holding the mine underwater. And then as it surfaced, they would then take shots at it with a gun and blow the mine up. Well, imagine what would happen if instead of the cable catching the mine, it was the trawler that caught the mine. And so several of those trawlers were lost in action as a result of minesweeping efforts. Secondly, during the First World War was a program led by the Imperial Munitions Board to build freighters, both wooden and steel. And so Collingwood becomes part of this national shipbuilding program that's headed up by Joseph Flavel, chair of the Imperial Munitions Board, William Gear, another Montreal shipping agent who was very active in the marine industry. And as you can see from the map on the screen, it's heavily concentrated in Victoria and Vancouver, also in Fort William and Port Arthur, especially Port Arthur. You can see the 2 dots for Collingwood and Midland. Moving down into that cluster around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, we have shipyards in Fort Erie and in Welland. There are actually 4 yards building ships in Toronto, which is difficult to imagine now. Heading further east, there's a cluster at Montreal and Sorel. And then moving into the Maritimes, building wooden ships in St. John, and actually steel ships in New Glasgow. It was a very ambitious program, building over 80 freighters for service in the First World War. And so what we have here is the slide Collingwood and the Steel Wars. So Collingwood Shipbuilding was responsible for constructing two 261-foot long, 3,250 deadweight ton steel freighters for the Imperial Munitions Board. So the length, of course, is dictated by the St. Lawrence River and the locks that are on the St. Lawrence. So it's still possible to navigate between the lower lakes and the Atlantic, but you've got to keep the vessel under 270 feet. The first was the War Wizard, which seems to have gotten through much of her original incarnation without being photographed. I think that there is a photograph of the War Wizard in Skip Gillam's comprehensive book on Collingwood shipbuilding. And I found one copy of a photograph at McGill, at McCord Museum in Montreal. But outside of that, it was extremely camera shy. It left Collingwood in June 1918 for ocean service and was sold by the British in 1920. Wound up under Italian registry, later transferring to Norwegian and Finnish flags. It would survive the Second World War and would eventually be broken up for scrap in Baltimore in 1955. So even though it was built as a somewhat inexpensive wartime contingency, it had almost a 40-year career as a merchant vessel. Her sister ship was the War Witch, which was much less camera shy. You can see several photographs involving the War Witch. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we see it under construction in, I think, August 1918. You can see the scaffolding in the upper right-hand corner, and that was very characteristic of all the vessels that were built at Collingwood, was this scaffold that would go around the entire ship as it was taking form. In the lower left-hand corner, we see the vessel after it's been launched, and it's now berthed, I think, in one of the dry docks. And this is where the ship would have continued to be fitted out. They made a point, I think, of putting in the boilers and the marine engines after the ship had launched, which reduced the potential for mischief. as that launch was taking place. Also, by this point, Collingwood now has the capacity to build its own marine engines, and you can see in the middle bottom row a triple expansion steam engine that would have been used in one of the freighters. And then last but not least, on the bottom right-hand corner is the finished product, ready to go out for its trials and eventually into service in the Atlantic. Somewhat ironically, at the end of the war, it too was sold to the Italians and stayed within Italian ownership for some time until it was finally torpedoed in December 1944, not by the Germans, not by the Italians, but by the Allies. By this time, this Collingwood ship was fighting on the wrong side. Well, in addition to freighters and trawlers, Collingwood is very active building tankers. Tankers were always in short supply during the war, and the Admiralty requisitioned any Canadian tanker that it could find because they were usually registered in Britain, and so it gave them control over those vessels. And so in order to compensate, Imperial Oil, in particular, engaged the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company to construct a fleet of tankers between June 1916 and April 1918. So there are 5 different tankers built: the Royalite, the Iokalite, the Sarnalite, the Reginalite, and the Terralite. Bit of a tongue twister, that last one. You can see the last vessel, the Terralite, in the bottom right-hand corner. I think the photograph to the left really gives you a good idea of how different this was from building a bulk carrier, or a canaller, or a passenger ship. This is something that required tanks that could be sealed. In the upper right-hand corner, I throw in a photograph of a ship launch. This is a very important activity in the life of every ship. And I'll say a little bit more about ship launchings shortly. But there's a ceremonial component to it. But I think what you've got to realize too is that what you don't see are the masses of Collingwood's residents who have gathered to watch another ship go down the ways and into the water. Well, Collingwood did not just build things, it also fixed things. And as I mentioned before, through the 19th century, which led to the demand for the Queen's dry dock in the 1880s, things go amiss when you have a ship. Due to collisions in the fog, or collisions because captains got their orders crossed, or ships that went aground. And you can see some examples on this slide of both of those events taking place. To the left is the Iroquois, and you can see all the plates that have been removed. At the bottom, near the stern, you can see the propeller and the rudder. So those stern plates must have been in very bad shape. And quite often, when a vessel ran aground, it would be that area of the ship that would be damaged. And so then they would come in and they'd remove the line of double rivets. You can see the holes for them across the midsection of the photograph, and actually straighten things out and put on new plate when they had the steel. To the right is the bow of the Saxona. This is 1917. This is an obvious example of one of those collisions that I've talked to you about. Serious damage done. Now, it's not like car accidents. You don't ask the question, is this a write-off? Particularly in the First World War, when steel was so scarce that not only would they fix anything that got damaged, but also if anything sank and it was diveable, it would be salvaged. And so unlike times before and after the war, where vessels would be lost and left lost, what we're seeing happen quite often, particularly during 1917, 1918, are those vessels being salvaged and brought into the shipyards to be fixed up and used again. Vessels were in such short supply and cost so much to manufacture that repair became an essential activity. As I mentioned before, these activities were frustrated by shortages. Marine machinery, for instance, such as in this photograph, was very difficult to find in many ways. You see a winch in the left side. In the right side, you see some of the instrumentation in the machine rooms, the engine rooms. Some of this material would come in from Montreal, but quite often it would have to be brought in from Britain. And if it was brought in from Britain, there's a good chance that it would be lost to a submarine. And this happened on a couple of occasions. And so shipyards across the country and in Collingwood found themselves in a situation where the hull would be finished, it would be ready to go, but they had no machinery to put into it because of the delays in getting it from the source locations, particularly Britain. Steel was another major problem. There was an 8-month delay in getting steel from the United States because until 1918, there was no steel plate mills in Canada. It all had to be purchased either from Britain or from the United States. The other challenge facing Leach and the shipyard was that of labor. As I mentioned before, Leach was from Britain, and he would write back to his colleagues in the British shipyards talking about what life was like. And the letter books that contains those letters are in the Collingwood Museum. So these are the documents that Susan and Melissa let me have a look at. It's really interesting to read Leach's letters, where he talks, for instance, about the workers in the Collingwood shipyard being productive, but in winter they had problems with beer and hockey. So even in 1913, 1914, beer and hockey were a problem. This isn't just a 20th century condition. His letters also reveal how far they had to go to get skilled labor. So they're looking for a chief's draftsman. They advertised in the Glasgow Herald and in some of the international shipbuilding journals. And they end up hiring someone from Shanghai. It took that person 4 weeks to get from Shanghai to Collingwood in order to work in the shipyard. The situation only got far worse during the First World War. 1905, there's approximately 200 men working in the shipyard. By 1917, they need over 1,000 to build the ships. One of the problems with that was not only trying to find skilled labor locally, but the fact that other shipyards, like the Thor Ironworks in Toronto, or Canadian Vickers in Montreal, would raid the Collingwood yard and induce people to leave. So it was not unusual to see people suddenly disappear. You can see the gang of riveters in the upper left-hand corner. There's actually a link in this document, but unfortunately we don't have it set up with internet access, with this really neat clip on YouTube about riveting at the John Brown shipyard in Glasgow. It's from the Second World War, but it looks like nothing's really changed all that much. People are still heating up the rivets in this oven, and then they throw them. And they're caught by hand, red hot, put in the hole, and they use pneumatic hammers to drive those rivets home until they cool off and contract. So it's a technology that really didn't evolve an awful lot between the wars, although welding does take place in the 1930s within the Collingwood yard. In the bottom right-hand corner is the Collingwood shipyard. Now this is actually a photograph from after the war. This is from the 1920s. But it gives you an idea of what life was like working in the shipyard in the winter. It's difficult to see, but these are actually a rivet gang at work, despite being surrounded by snow. At the Marine Museum in Kingston, they have the employee cards from the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company. It's striking to see how many people only lasted 2 days. What's surprising is that there's only one card that says the reason for not reporting back was too cold. I would imagine that Collingwood must have been pretty cold, particularly since the winter of 1917-1918 was notorious for how cold it was. So cold that the locomotives would freeze on the railways. And so in this shortage of men who were needed to go off and fight in Europe, we have women joining the workforce. And so in 1917, we see women hard at work in the machine shop at Collingwood Shipyard. A couple of things that's worth noting. The first activity that they get put onto is building high explosive shells. And in 1915, before these shipbuilding orders come in, probably 3/4 of the profit of the shipyard was made for manufacturing high explosive shells to be used in the battles in Europe. But by 1917, because they need food so much, they don't have the shipyards building shells anymore. Instead, they're building ships, and the women get put in place in the machine shop working on parts for the marine engines. So you see them hard at work here. In many ways, Collingwood was far ahead of the other shipyards in Canada, who really resisted employing women to work in the shipyard during the First World War. But it didn't take long in Collingwood. By the 1920s, as the men come back from the war, in the bottom right-hand photograph, you see that women have got rid of their coveralls and are back into their dresses and are just working in the office rather than in the machine shop. The next major initiative during this period is the development of the Canadian government merchant marine. And so by 1917, as I mentioned before, Britain has run out of money. And they turn to Canada to start paying for all of this steel shipbuilding that's going on in the country. That's one of the reasons why there were such massive Victory loan programs and why Canadians subscribed. In the Canadian shipyards, workers were actually encouraged to subscribe because they knew that would keep their yard going, that would keep them employed at a time of rampaging inflation. And so Canada, realizing that it's bearing all of this burden of paying for these ships, decided to build their own merchant navy. Plus, by this point, Britain had requisitioned almost all of the available commercial tonnage. And so if Canada had any hope of competing in the reconstruction that would follow World War I, it needed to have its own fleet. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. And so in this Canadian government merchant marine were 68 vessels. The freighters, very much that you can see here on the screen. 9 were built in Collingwood. General cargo, again 260 feet long, a beam of 43.5 feet, 4,000 deadweight ton. One of the interesting stories about the Collingwood shipyard is that by 1920, the yard in Toronto, the Dominion Shipbuilding Company at the foot of Bathurst Street, that had the contract to build 2 of these freighters, ends up going bankrupt. And so they send the crews from Collingwood down to Toronto. That didn't go over well with the local unions. And so the newspapers in Toronto are replete with stories about the police having to be called in to break up the brawls that were occurring when the Collingwood boys came down from the shipyard. I should also note before leaving this slide that several of these vessels go on to fight in World War II, or serve in World War II. In fact, one of them, the Canadian Rover, was sunk by a US torpedo in 1942. Again, several of them wound up on the wrong side. So by 1919, this is what the shipyard looks like. Quite a bit different than what Collingwood looks like today. We can see dry dock number 1, not too far from the museum. Just above it is dry dock number 2, the one that was opened in 1908 to 1909. It was constructed. Further along, you can see the building scaffolding. So they're building ships just to the left of dry dock number 2, and then additional slips, which then get filled in much later in the 1970s when the shipyard expands to accommodate computer-assisted drive design and manufacturing. This is one of the first aerial photographs that were taken by the that's George. I can actually deem myself aboard now. So you can see the wing in the bottom corner here. So this is the wing of the Bishop Barker Company aircraft. So these, of course, are the 2 famous World War I aces from Canada, Billy Bishop and William Barker. And they get together in Toronto, and after, for a time, offering charter flights to the Muskokas for all the wealthy people in Toronto, they then also start this business of taking aerial photographs. And so some of the earliest aerial photographs of Ontario were taken in 1919. And here we can see the Collingwood shipyard. It's interesting to look at the way that Saturday Night describes it in 1919. And I have a quote here. As an instance of the economical importance of the shipbuilding industry of Canada in general, we might consider the case of the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company, with its shipyards and dry docks at Collingwood and Kingston. The great yard of the company at Collingwood covers over 30 acres of ground space, gives employment to some 1,500 men, but is capable of employing double that should future conditions warrant. With their families, these workmen must represent nearly 1/4 of the population of Collingwood, which indicates the very great importance of the company. The company is also one of the oldest steel shipbuilding establishments in Canada, and the advantage of having such a training ground when the war broke out and ships were so urgently required can be readily understood as the men who were trained in Collingwood can now be found at shipyards from Victoria to Halifax. So this is one of Collingwood's contributions to the war and to shipbuilding, is training people to go off and work elsewhere as the industry rapidly expands. So, was this optimism justified? Well, initially it looked that way. And so during the 1920s, after Collingwood has completed its work for the Canadian Government Merchant Marine, its workers were kept busy with a variety of projects that reflected its traditional strengths in canalers, bulk carriers, and a hopper barge, but also introduced a few specialty vessels. So in the upper left-hand corner, we see the Charles Dick. Now, Charles was only 6 years old when the ship was named after him, but this becomes quite an important ship for those of us who live in the evil empire to the south in Toronto. This is a sandsucker, and what it would do is it would move out and moor in some of the shallower areas of Lake Ontario and also in Lake Erie and suck sand up from the bottom. In some ways it was similar to a dredge, but unlike a dredge, it brought the sand back to the foot of Bathurst Street, where the Harbour Brick Company was located. And the sand from the bottom of Lake Ontario was used to manufacture bricks that actually built the homes in the city after World War I. It stays in operation until the 1960s or 70s, until there's growing environmental concern about what happens when you take all this sand off the bottom of Lake Ontario. In the upper right, we see a canaler. This is the Robert J. Buck that was built for the George Holland Company and Coal and Shipping Corporation in May 1925. This is one of these vessels that would be restricted in length to the length of the canals. And it was used to move packet freight on pallets quite often, as opposed to the bulk carriers such as the Royalton, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. One of the things that I want to stress here is that when you look along the bottom edge, you really get a sense of how many people came out to watch these launchings. It was a real connection between waterfront industry and the community. Now you may recall that when we looked at the late 19th century, the early 20th century, how important council was, how important the concessions that council gave to encourage the industry. And you can really see this connection. So not only did the town make much of its livelihood from the shipyard, but it also came out to celebrate the creation of these ships and adding these ships to Canada's merchant marine. And lastly, in the bottom right, I want to mention the tug Ruil. This was built for the Toronto Harbour Commission. So this is one of the ways I got to know about the Collingwood shipyard. I was going through the archives of the Harbour Commission. This was built in 1929. It's a fireboat as well as a tug. In the Second World War, when it's working down in Halifax, it actually prevents an explosion that would have been very similar to the Great Halifax explosion of 1917. It towed the ammunition vessel away before the damage could be done. One other point I want to make about the 1920s. The boys are at it again. 1927, the directors of the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company resign, and they're replaced by John Leach, Horace Smith, Roy Woven, Joseph Norcross. Smith becomes the president, Woven becomes vice president, along with Leach, and Leach is appointed the general manager. So Collingwood is expanding once again. They've taken over Kingston in 1916, 1917. Now they've taken over Port Arthur. The only shipbuilding firm it didn't seem to get its hands on was James Playfair's yard in Midland. Moving on to the lean times of the Depression. So after the stock markets crashed in October 1929, Collingwood produced only 4 vessels during the following decade. 2 tugs for the Department of Public Works, a gate lifter scow for use on the Welland Canal in 1930, and the survey vessel William J. Stewart for the Department of Mines and Resources, June 1932. We can see the William J. Stewart in the upper left-hand corner here, a very tidy-looking little vessel. But I also included this one. What keeps the yard going in this very, very difficult decade is ship repair. And this ship is quite interesting. It's the John Ericsson. It is what's known as a whaleback. This is a ship that was designed by Alex McDougall, the captain who actually was one of the first directors of the Collingwood Shipyard in 1910. So this is one of McDougall's products. And I don't know if you can see it here, but there are no sharp edges. This is all round. The bow's rounded. The gunnels are not, they're rounded and coming in. It's meant to be more seaworthy that way. That idea didn't really catch on all that well, but the Ericsson's an interesting example of McDougall's naval architecture. We often talk about how many people worked at the Collingwood Shipyard. I mentioned in 1905 it was 200. By 1917 it was over 1,000. And when you hear people talk about the shipyard, it creates this impression of sustained employment and sustained livelihood for the families who lived in Collingwood. What I want to draw your attention to is that it didn't really happen that way. 1936, John Leach is after federal support. He's trying to get a renewed subsidy for the dry dock. It had run out, it had run its course under the legislation, and they need the extra financial support from the Dominion government, from the government of Canada to get by. And so one of the pieces of evidence that he submits is this chart that tracks employment in the Collingwood Shipyard from 1916 to 1936. And it's really quite interesting. So you can see here trawlers. So this is in 1919. At this point, they're building the War Wizard and the War Witch. They're starting work on the Canadian Government Merchant Marine. And by looking at the numbers here, the workforce is over 1,000. But quickly, as we get into 1920, you see this tremendous drop-off. It was not unusual for 350 to 400 people to be laid off at a time. And so by the time that we get in to 1921, very few people are working here, sometimes a little more than 100. Or maybe if there's a repair job, there'll be over 200. Things don't pick up really until the Charles Dick is constructed. And we see at one point 400 people working on the project. The freighter Dalrymple, another spike in employment. The Royalton, that we saw in a previous slide, suddenly we're back up into the hundreds again. So it's up and down. I mean, if anybody had a heart rhythm like that, you'd be in serious trouble. Now we move into the 1930s. So this is the early years of the Depression, and you see that we're beginning to flatline. We're beginning to have less than 50 people working in the shipyard to keep the place open when there are no ships to repair and no contracts to build ships. Things were in desperate condition. And so they looked to the federal government for more support, and instead what came along was war. And as terrible as war is, for the Collingwood Shipyard, it provided a resurgence. I'm sure many of you have seen the books and heard the stories about the corvettes and the minesweepers, the Algerine-class minesweepers that were built in Collingwood, along with 5 Western Isles trawlers, again more minesweepers, and 3 tankers, always a need for tankers. So in the 1940s, we're seeing a sharp rise in workers again. 1,300 people are working in the shipyard, launching a ship every 2 weeks. A significant accomplishment. Never happened like that in the First World War. Much like the First World War, women are hired, but this time they're in the yard. They're welding. They're not like Rosie the Riveter. They're actually welding ships in the shipyard. It's amazing how much they have evolved from the First World War, when they were not apparently fit to, were working in the shipyard and now playing a major role in the constructions of the corvettes and the minesweepers. Some of these days would be 15 hours long. and they'd be working 6 days a week. Much like the First World War, production was key. Turn out those warships as quickly as possible, as well as the tankers. Peace in the Seaway brings many changes. On the left side, we can see the launch of the bulk carrier Hochelaga for the Canada Steamship Lines, which actually bought the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company in 1946. So we're put into a consortium along with the Davie Shipbuilding and Repair Company, along with Port Arthur, along with Kingston, a division of Canada Steamship Lines. The passenger trade drops out of the CSL fleet and focuses instead on freight. And you can see some of the, one of the freighters being built down here, the Montclair, 1956, in April, as well as tankers for Imperial Oil again, this decades-long relationship between Collingwood Shipbuilding and Imperial Oil. Reciprocating engines are giving way to turbine-driven ships. And also during this period, we're seeing the emergence of the self-unloading bulk carriers. And it's in Collingwood where this technology is being perfected in the drafting office, working with the naval architects. The designs that are coming out of Collingwood are driving operations in Davie. So once again, Collingwood becomes a center for training and development that plays a critical role within the industry. The Seaway, however, also led to the demise of the Kingston Shipyard. Its old canalers were sold off, or the CSL sold off its old canalers, and since this fleet no longer wintered at Kingston, the yard lost a valuable source of income through the winter. And so the shipyard was closed in 1967, the buildings razed, and unsold equipment was transferred to Collingwood. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this was also a dangerous business. May 29th, 1969, thousands of residents, tourists, and photographers gathered to watch the launch of Canada Steamship Lines bulk carrier Tadoussac. A massive vessel, 730 feet long, capacity of more than 20,000 gross tons, able to carry almost 25 tons of grain. As was the normal practice, almost 200 men were under the vessel, driving in wedges to raise the bow of the ship to a launch position. So that's the activity that's going on up here. 15 minutes before the scheduled launch, the stern began to slip toward the water and the bow went in the opposite direction. Men scrambled for safety within seconds, but 2 men were killed. Alvin Wagner, 47, a father of 3, who dove into the water when he could find no other way out, and Douglas Moir, 48, a father of 7, who lived in Stayner. Another 40 men were injured, several quite seriously. The bodies of dead men were later recovered by the divers. You can see the divers at work down here. They were the first fatalities during a launch since the opening of the shipyard. The cause was later determined likely to be a rotten trigger timber, 7-foot long, foot-thick oak timbers to support the ship after it had been raised by wedges. You can see the Tadoussac sitting in the dry dock after the launch, the premature launch, and the trail of debris that was left that they were trying to sort through, initially to find the injured and to find the dead, but also to find the cause for what happened. Well, my hour is drawing to a close, so it's probably a good time to move towards the close of the history. By the time that we get to the 1970s, bulk carriers dominate construction. The decade marked the upgrades to the plant to integrate computer-assisted design and parts production, and the expansion of the physical plant on site, new buildings constructed. And the focus was on self-unloading bulk carriers that led to an important relationship with the Algoma Central Railway Company, which purchased 1/3 of the ships produced by the Collingwood shipyards during this period. By 1985, sales peaked at around $100 million. All sounds very promising, but there are very serious undercurrents. There is a worldwide slump in shipping. And also in Korea and Brazil, the rates being charged by the shipyards seriously undercut what was being paid in Canada. We have a situation where the workforce, because they're highly skilled, are demanding good wages. They realize that the profits being made by Canada Steamship Lines are as a result of their hard work in the shipyard, their skill in the shipyard. That leads, of course, to the occasional strike. It also leads to a situation where the shipyard is constantly going back to the federal government with its other peers in the industry, arguing for subsidies. In the 1970s, there's a couple of government programs that helped. Initially, there was a 12% subsidy, later increased to 20% in the early 1970s, and it staved off what seemed to many like the inevitable outcome. That even though companies like Algoma were buying these very impressive cell-phone motors, you can see the launch of the Algo Port in 1979. And in the bottom right, we have the Algo Wood carrying salt in 2002 as it enters the Duluth Ship Channel. This was built in 1981. So even though things look promising because of these orders that are coming in from Algoma, keeping the place going, they recognize that unless they can get sustained orders, that the likelihood of offering sustained employment was negligible. And so we come to the shipyard's last vessel, the icebreaker Sir Wilfrid Laurier. At a press conference on the 12th of September 1986, owners announced the closure of the Collingwood shipyards due to a worldwide crisis in the global shipbuilding industry, greater domestic supply than demand, idle Canadian vessels, the increasing size of the Great Lakes ships outstripping the capacity of the dry dock, and it costing more than $4 million a year to keep the yard open while waiting for more work. In 1986, employment fell from 800 to 50. The final side launch occurred in December 6, 1986, when the Sir Wilfrid Laurier came down the ways. The equipment was dismantled and distributed amongst the yards at Port Weller, Thunder Bay, and Pictou. There was an attempt by Collingwood Shipyards to get the federal government to give them the money to extend their dry dock to over 1,000 feet. That was the length that was required to service the vessels being built for the Great Lakes trade at that point, but the money was not forthcoming. And now the moment that you've all been waiting for. The Collingwood shipyards have provided well-paying jobs for skilled labor that span 3 generations. Many workers were able to find work at the shipyards of Port Arthur and Port Weller, but even those two would eventually die off. Port Arthur closes up really in the mid-1980s, not long after Collingwood shut. Port Weller eked by with a ship repair industry, but really much of the shipbuilding activity is now going on in Halifax, with attempts by the firm in Montreal to wrest that away as quickly as possible. In summary, 200 new ships built in Collingwood, a substantial contribution to Canada's maritime heritage. The Government of Canada was Collingwood's biggest client. Almost 1/3 of the contracts were for tugs, Navy ships, tankers, dredges, bulk carriers, passenger and freight vessels, and Coast Guard tenders. Were it not for those federal contracts, particularly during the 1930s, perhaps the yard would have closed 50 years before it eventually did. Canada Steamship Lines was the largest private client. It commissioned 23 new vessels, but 18 other vessels built by Collingwood eventually wound up as part of the CSL fleet. Algoma Central Marine Railway was very important, ordering 15 ships. Imperial Oil, as I mentioned, ordered 13 tankers from the shipyard. And N.M. Patterson and Sons was another important shipping company, ordering 9 canalers. At its peak, Collingwood shipyards employed 1,200 workers from a 50-kilometer radius. It was the largest manufacturer on the Great Lakes. And now when you drive by the site, there's nothing there to remind you. And that's why I think programs like the Collingwood Museum and its archives and its exhibits, the film that plays over and over again, when you're doing research there, which I still find interesting. It's important to keep that legacy alive, but it's also important for organizations like the Collingwood and District Historical Society to talk about it, and to remember that Collingwood was an important industrial town before it became a recreational center. That, in some ways, what happened to Collingwood is representative of what has happened to much of Ontario's industrial legacy. There is no remnant at all of the 4 shipyards from Toronto's experience during the First World War or during the Second World War, when it too built minesweepers. And now we're looking at the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes in Kingston possibly closing down because the federal government sold the dry dock and the developer wants it to start paying rent and pay taxes. So they have until the end of the year to sort themselves out. Our maritime heritage is disappearing. I hope that you'll join with me in celebrating that heritage. It's important. We're a country with thousands of kilometers of coastline. And yet, as Steve Paikin pointed out on an episode of The Agenda a couple of years ago, we have a bad case of sea blindness. We seem to have forgotten that we have a maritime past. So I hope that you found this interesting. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them now. Moir, would you like to go home? I'm fine with that too. Yes?
What was the total number of ships again built in Collingwood?
It's either 206 or 208.
Is that including the trawlers, the smaller ones, everything?
Yes, everything.
Combined.
Let me just see if I have the exact number for you here. It's somewhere between 206 and 208.
Very good. Thank you.
Imperial Oil doesn't even have its tankers now.
No.